some of you, or perhaps good evening even. And welcome to our keynote lecture session. We are very happy and honored to be able to welcome Lynn Morgan today to give the keynote lecture. She is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at Mount Holyoke College, Massachusetts, USA. And as a medical anthropologist and feminist science studies scholar, she has already been leaving a mark on the field. Together with Elizabeth Roberts, she co-authored crucial articles on the notion of reproductive governance and has been developing that since. So I'm sure she doesn't need any more introduction to most of you, and I'm very happy to give the floor to Lynn.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that nice introduction, and also to Monica for co-organizing this conference on the anthropology of reproductive governance and justice. It's really an honor for me to be invited to participate and to get to learn more about your work. So thank you all for being here and for being in the conversation together, because I have felt very much, and you'll see throughout this talk today, that none of us does this work on our own, that we're all in it together, that we're supporting each other, and that we learn so much from each other and are also nourishing and caring for each other in this work. So as you know, I work mainly in Latin America, but Joanna Mishtal and Sylvia DeSordo's work in Europe, in Poland, and in Spain and Italy, as well as Sita Salik's work in Turkey, has me thinking a lot about our national and regional borders and boundaries, and how, in a sense, they've limited our ability to connect with each other across these different hemispheres, even though many of the issues that we're confronting in reproductive governance and the same are shared across borders. So increasingly, we're realizing that issues of reproductive governance are very much cross-border issues, global issues, and it's really important for us to be communicating with one another across these borders and across languages as well. So I wanted to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge the importance of us working together to try and understand what's going on in different contexts. This is kind of unusual for anthropologists. As many of you know, we're used to working in pretty localized kind of environments. And so the kinds of tools that are available to us have been somewhat limited. At least I have felt that they've been somewhat limited. And that what we've been doing is working more in a national context rather than in an international context or a cross-national context. And so the concept of reproductive governance is one that was really designed to allow us to see some of what was going on in these other contexts as well, and how they're influencing one another. So what I'd like to do is share my screen with you, and I'll present an outline of the talk and then go through it for approximately 40 minutes or so, and then leave us plenty of time for discussion and conversation. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. So can you see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'd like to do in today's talk is I've divided it into 4 sections. The first part talks just briefly about what reproductive governance is. And I'm assuming that many of you are familiar with the concept, but that there may also be people who are listening today who aren't familiar with the concept. And then I'll talk about why I think the notion of reproductive governance has caught on. It's Liz Roberts and I published the article on reproductive governance 9 years ago, so it's been almost a decade that scholars have been using it. And Liz and I have both been a little surprised, I have to say, about how much it's been taken up and how it's caught on. So I wanted to think a little bit, use this talk today to think a little bit about why it's caught on, and then move to the third section, which is to think about how scholars are using reproductive governance. And I want to highlight the work of just a few of the many people who are using this concept and what it is that I think they're doing that's unique. And then finally, I want to spend a few minutes talking about a project that I'm working on currently, which has to do with a non-binding international declaration put together by right-wing anti-abortion conservatives called the Geneva Consensus Declaration. Some of you may have heard of it. It's something that a lot of people thought died out when Trump was no longer in office in the United States, but in fact, it's continuing to be used as a technology of global reproductive governance. And so I want to talk about that before I close. So first, to talk about what reproductive governance is. When Liz Roberts and I defined it, we referred to the mechanisms through which different historical configurations of actors, such as the state, religious hierarchies and coalitions, international financial institutions, non-governmental organizations, and social movements use a variety of legislative controls, economic inducements, moral injunctions, direct coercion, and ethical incitements to produce, monitor, and control reproductive behaviors and population policies. So what we really wanted to do was to focus attention on shifting political rationalities in different regions and different countries, and to think about how states make reproduction and sexuality central to their political ambitions and their agendas. You might have wondered why reproductive governance, why was it necessary? After all, we have other tools to use analytically. In public health and epidemiology, in women's health, people have talked about reproductive health for a long time. We've talked about reproductive rights, which obviously focuses on the human rights framework and rights talk and the legal context. And we've also talked about reproductive justice being a concept that owes a lot to Black feminism in the United States and elsewhere, and thinks about the contexts that are necessary in order for people to make reproductive choices and to live out their lives, whether they decide to have children or not to have children, and to do that in a way which acknowledges their right to housing and to health care and to carceral justice and so forth. So all of these concepts, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice, have all been used as rallying cries to advocate for particular kinds of policies. And what I mean by that is that the scholars and the activists who have been using those concepts have been using them as activists. Reproductive justice is reproductive governance, is a little bit different because it's a theoretical tool that allows us to embrace our feminist political commitments and scholarly analysis at the same time. And what that means is that it allows us to be reflexive and sometimes even self-critical. And this is something that's been missing a lot, I think, in some of the other approaches that have been used to think about reproductive justice, is to think about being self-critical, even of movements that we support. Now, there are obvious reasons why it's difficult for us to do that. It's politically very difficult to acknowledge, especially publicly, that there are things that our movements could be doing differently. But I think it's really important that we do that and that we acknowledge that with each other, that we're all caught up in this world of reproductive governance, and that it's something that we need to think very critically about, including our own involvement in it. So when Liz and I first started writing about this, we were working in Latin America, both of us. She was working in Ecuador on in vitro fertilization, and I was working in Costa Rica and also in Argentina at the time on in vitro fertilization and on concepts of reproductive justice. And we were noticing that there had been a shift in Latin America from Cold War era population control and family planning policies to, in the mid-90s, a shift after the International Conference for Population and Development in Cairo and in Beijing, a shift to looking at reproductive rights, and on the conservative side to looking at life, at the culture of life and so forth. So we'd noticed this shift starting to take hold in the places that we were working, and we had noticed that it seemed to be linked to some of the economic changes that were going on, such as the expansion of neoliberalism and private sector medicine. Whereas, as Liz Roberts wrote, internationally, rights-based discourses have flourished in the context of economic policies that promote the expansion of private sector medicine, and they've pitted citizens against states in the legal arena where rights can be debated. So what we were seeing in many of the contexts in which we were working was an increase in disputes about allocating rights to groups of people that had previously been unrecognized as rights holders. And these included the landless, indigenous people, women, sexual minorities, and increasingly what Right to Life people called the unborn. At the time that we were writing, abortion was still highly illegal in most of Latin America. Mexico City had just recently legalized abortion in the first trimester. Since that time, since the time that we were writing, abortion has been legalized in Uruguay and Argentina. It's been decriminalized in Mexico. The results of the recent court case there are still being debated. It's up for contention right now as we speak in Colombia, where activists are working very hard to have abortion removed from the penal code. And abortion restrictions have been relaxed in Chile and in Ecuador. At the same time, we've seen the expansion of same-sex marriage in 6 or 7 countries in Latin America, including in Chile just yesterday, ever since Argentina legalized same-sex marriage in 2010. El Salvador was just sanctioned last week by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in a case called Manuela, saying that women cannot be penalized or incarcerated for suffering obstetrical emergencies. So all of these things were going on at the time that we were writing. There was a huge shift going on from post-Cold War population control and so forth to a real emphasis on rights. At the same time, there was a backlash against this and Liz and I were both concerned about the appearance of anti-abortion groups, including a lot of groups that are based in the United States that were starting to appear in Latin America. So let's talk now about why reproductive governance caught on. The concept of reproductive governance captures the centrality of reproduction to diverse political agendas, as Elise Singer has written. It allows us, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, to be analytical border crossers, to go beyond national boundaries, to try and account for globalized political movements, including populism, nationalism, and anti-gender movements. I know you know about this in Europe more than anywhere else in the world, perhaps. And also global health and development initiatives that have implications for reproductive governance, even when they don't name reproductive health issues. And I'll say more about that later when we talk about the Geneva Consensus Declaration. The concept of reproductive governance builds on and expands the frameworks of reproductive health, rights, and justice. And it uses a lot of the concepts that feminists have come up with, including the concept of stratified reproduction, meaning whose reproduction is encouraged and whose reproduction is discouraged. And it also includes the work of Black feminist scholars, including Dorothy Roberts, Loretta Ross, Zakiya Luna, Kiara Bridges, Dana Ayin Davis, and many, many others. The concept of reproductive governance connects reproduction to economic changes and to new subjectivities or new categories of subject that have been developed in different parts of the world. So it connects shifts in what we might call the life debates, what Michelle Murphy has called the life debates, to economic changes such as neoliberalism, which has led to the privatization of healthcare in many locations and of family-based care, the reduction of government welfare programs, and the blaming of immigrants. All of these policies have come together in some places. We're seeing this in the United States right now. We're seeing it in Russia, in Italy, and elsewhere to promote pronatalism. And in Brazil, as I'll talk about in a few minutes with Claudia Fonseca's work, to promote adoption as a substitute for other kinds of reproductive rights, including abortion rights. Reproductive governance also shows us how new subjectivities and identities emerge. For example, self-reliant consumers who require very little from state institutions and yet are encouraged and encourage ourselves to seek out services on the private market. And we might think about things like egg freezing as an example of this. And the concept of reproductive governance also allows us to see how reproductive governance is linked to evangelical and fundamentalist religious movements. And there are big links right now between religious and political movements in different countries where politicians are playing on religion to try and increase their base and to incite particular kinds of ethical engagements. So from here, I'd like to talk about how scholars are using reproductive governance. And I'd like to highlight some of the many sources of inspiration that I have relied on. As I said earlier, this kind of work is not being done by any one of us, but by all of us working together and thinking about and learning from one another. So Laura Briggs is someone who's been very central to the work that I've been doing. She's a historian who works in the US and Latin America on empire and on adoption policy, as well as on reproductive politics in the United States. There's a new book out called Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Movement, which uses a case study of Poland to argue that the new anti-gender movement is part of a new political configuration. The authors don't use the concept of reproductive governance explicitly, but they could have. They say opposition to gender has become a key element of the rise of right-wing populism, which successfully harnesses the anxiety, shame, and anger caused by neoliberalism and threatens to destroy liberal democracy. And I would argue that this is exactly what we meant, what Liz Roberts and I meant by the concept of reproductive governance. And so it's very relevant here. I also have relied a lot on the work of Loretta Ross, who's a Black feminist scholar who was one of the people who coined the term reproductive justice with her colleagues at Sister Song, and has been outspoken in her advocacy of reproductive justice, especially in the United States. And then my Latin American colleagues, Juan Marco Baggioni and his team at the University in Córdoba in Argentina, who have talked a lot about the links between reproductive and sexual rights and justice, and see these things as indistinguishable, which I think has been very important for me, because in the United States, the reproductive justice movement and the reproductive and the same-sex marriage movement, or LGBTQ+ movement, have been separate from one another. And Juan Marco and his colleagues talk about these things being linked, that they're part of a conservative movement to have control over our bodies and sexual expression, and they need to be seen as part of the same movement, which of course is an insight that has political implications as well, because it means that LGBT folks and reproductive rights and justice folks support one another in our struggles, which are, after all, the same struggle. And then my friend and colleague Gaby Arguedas, working in Costa Rica, is talking a lot about the rise of conservative fundamentalism and the importance of that to understanding what's happening with reproductive justice. I'd like to turn at this point to a couple of case studies of particular works that have come out over the last 10 years that have used the concept of reproductive governance. And a couple of the presenters in this conference, I'm happy to say, are some of the authors of the works that I'm going to be discussing today. One of them is sociologist Siri Su, whose recent book examines post-abortion care in Senegal. And it's a book that I would recommend to all of you if you haven't looked at it yet. It's a really important book and a very sophisticated analysis of post-abortion care as a kind of compromise in the realm of global women's health, which is ostensibly an effort to reduce maternal mortality. But as Siri shows in her ethnographic work in Senegal, post-abortion care only treats women after their lives have been endangered by clandestine abortion. It doesn't prevent clandestine abortion, and it doesn't even create space for trying to prevent clandestine abortion through changes in the law. Because the existence of post-abortion care, as Siri says, thwarts efforts to legalize abortion in Senegal. The protocols of post-abortion care encourage hospital personnel to count induced abortions as spontaneous abortions, in other words, to misclassify the cases that are coming into the hospital. And hence it creates metrics that do not allow us to establish whether post-abortion care lowers maternal mortality. The thing that I think is so exciting about Siri's work is the way that it takes a case study of what's going on in particular hospitals and clinics in Senegal and puts it into not just a national but an international context, where it really looks at global health discourses around post-abortion care and identifies this concept of post-abortion care as an important technology of reproductive governance. So moving along here, I'd like to mention also the work of Marta Holland, who is an anthropologist working from Finland, who has done ethnographic research in Zambia, analyzing abortion policies. And she and the other members of her team started out, I think, thinking about the law in a comparative study that they were doing in 3 African countries. But they found that looking at the law didn't really allow them to capture what they were seeing in the different countries where they were working. So she uses the concept of reproductive governance to help her move beyond legal frameworks to the multiplicity of social and political mechanisms and processes that are involved in transforming reproductive health policies to on-the-ground practice. Middle managers, she says, must interpret a national abortion law that appears liberal on paper, but in practice is very inaccessible and stigmatized. And Marta focuses on these middle managers who are the regional health authorities and also people working in hospitals, hospital directors and clinicians who are put into a position where they have to interpret the law themselves. And I would just point out that this focus on middle managers, on the people who are charged with implementing national policy, is something that a number of anthropologists have been doing. And I think it's really important because that level of personnel often tends to get overlooked in the debates that are going on within women's health, reproductive rights, and also reproductive justice. How are abortion policies actually being implemented? Who's charged with doing that? And what kinds of challenges do they face? Seda Salek has also been doing this in her work on Turkey, where she looks at how nurses are charged with surveillance over their pregnant patients. So Marta's work focuses on Christian moral regimes that are invoked in Zambia to both create a national discourse around morality and Christian ethics. But these discourses also confuse medical personnel and make them uncertain about what needs to be done, what they're allowed to do, what they're being encouraged to do, because the law says one thing, and yet there is this moral regime which is telling them something else. So this moral regime is used to shame women and to shame health providers, and also to silence public conversations about abortion in Zambia. Not advancing. Let's see if I can. In my next example, I would like to talk about a book that's just about to come out by Elise Singer called Lawful Sins. It's subtitled Abortion Rights and Reproductive Governance in Mexico. Elise Singer analyzes first trimester abortion, which has been available free and on demand in Mexico City since 2007 or 2008. Legalization, she says, advances women's rights and bodily autonomy, but it also allows the state and the church to impose ideas about how women should behave and what constitutes responsible reproductive citizenship. So Elise says that health providers transmit a suite of values about personal responsibility and self-regulation by encouraging women to use birth control, linking abortion rights then to responsible reproductive subjectivity. So she's talking here again about the creation of responsible reproductive subjects. How is it that they're being cultivated within the Mexican context of legal abortion in the clinics? She concludes that the new era of access to abortion services doesn't end up being a radical departure from earlier regimes of reproductive regulation in Mexico. So this is important because things change, but they also stay the same. And so she looks at how reproductive governance is unfolding in that context. Things will change in Mexico with the new rulings, and we'll see how things evolve as time goes on. The next example that I'd like to talk about is Claudia Fonseca's work. I think she's also participating in this conference, which talks about about adoption in Brazil. In Brazil, the state bans informal adoptions and has set up bureaucratic hurdles to try and prevent them, but ends up allowing them anyway. And so she's looking at these workarounds and how it is that official policy says one thing, but the reality is somewhat different. State officials, she said, force adoptable children to parade before potential adoptive parents in beauty pageant style events. If you look for this online, you can find pictures of it. It's very disturbing to see the way that state officials thought it might be a good idea to take adoptable children who were older and maybe somewhat difficult to adopt, and to parade them across the stage in hopes that somebody might find them attractive enough or appealing enough to adopt them. The policy of encouraging adoption in Brazil allows state officials, who Claudia says are bruised by interminable political scandals, to market themselves as beneficent functionaries who work to find families for these adoptees. And we might think about this in the context of adoption being a Christian imperative and a central feature of President Bolsonaro's pro-natalist, so-called pro-life and pro-family policies. So adoption is something that we're hearing more about in the United States these days as well. There was just a hearing of a case that many observers think is likely to overturn the Roe v. Wade decision. And one of the analyses that I heard a couple days ago of this from a couple of legal scholars said that the case is likely to hinge on the availability of adoption as an alternative to abortion. And he thought that it might be likely that the newest justice, Amy Coney Barrett, might be asked to write the decision that eliminates Roe v. Wade, because she is herself the mother of 7 children, including a few adopted children. The final example that I'd like to give today is from the work of Bruna Alvarez, who's also present at this conference, and Diana Mare, talking about motherhood in Spain. Their recent article appeared in Medical Anthropology, and it's called Motherhood in Spain, From the Baby Boom to Structural Infertility. In this article, they used their interviews to identify mechanisms of reproductive governance, in other words, from the ground up. So these came up out of their interviews, and they identified 4 moral regimes that occur around the labor market, around gender relations in the home, around institutional feminist discourses, and around the narrative of choice. And they look at how their interviewees identify and talk about the moral regimes in these 4 areas, and about their consequent responsibilities of mothering. And they use this to explain the fact that mothers are consider themselves to be socially and financially responsible for children. And that this in turn explains how Spain went from a baby boom in the 1950s through the 1970s to structural infertility from 1990 to the present. And so they're using the concept of reproductive governance to explain fertility decline, and to explain that not just from the top down in terms of state policies that are pro-natalist in the face of declining fertility, but also from the bottom up, thinking about how their interviewees think about reproductive governance as it applies to their own bodies and their own lives. So to sum up here in this portion, let's talk about some of the insights that are gained from this work. The authors see moral regimes developing and taking hold in the context of labor market constraints and legal constraints, as well as religious ideologies, and including global health and development goals like the Sustainable Development Goals and practices. So how is it that the context of global health policy and global health practice affects what's going on in reproductive governance? And this, I'm thinking particularly of the work of Siri Su. Another one of the insights has to do with how moral injunctions work to enforce self-discipline, as well as the disciplining of others in a biopolitical sense, and responsible citizenship. How moral injunctions silence dissent and debate, and how moral injunctions create notions of proper reproductive behavior. These insights show us that we can identify what's going on in global health and development regimes that invent and perpetuate ideas and practices like post-abortion care and Christian nationhood. Another thing that I would emphasize here is that we need to follow the money. And this is something that I think anthropologists are just starting to do, to look at who profits from certain reproductive health policies. I think this is part of Siri Su's next project on the off-label use of misoprostol. And we can think about this in relation also to egg freezing and to in vitro fertilization. And when we think about who's profiting, we're thinking not just about the pharmaceutical industry, but also about feminist NGOs that might benefit from things staying as they are, that might benefit from the status quo. So this is an area that I think needs more work, and I would like to see more people working in this area of just following the money. So to continue thinking about the insights that come out of this work, all of these authors have done in one way and another what Liz Roberts and I suggested in the article that we published 9 years ago. They're analyzing these legislative controls, economic inducements. They're also identifying global health metrics, which is something that we didn't talk about, but we should have, and it's been clear how important that's become. They've analyzed moral injunctions, direct coercion, and ethical incitements that produce, monitor, and control reproductive behaviors. They've done exactly what we asked and more. They've identified the convergence of caring and punitive strategies of governance. So we will see when we talk about the Geneva Consensus Declaration that there has been a convergence of kind of caring and punitive strategies where states say we don't want to necessarily promote abortion, we want to reduce abortion, or we want to eliminate abortion, but at the same time we want to exalt motherhood and we want to show how much we care for women and girls. These authors have also critiqued feminism for defining motherhood as a choice and for endorsing maternal health strategies such as post-abortion care, cross-border in vitro fertilization, and surrogacy that harm women's health. So feminism is also implicated here. There are ways in which the feminist movement itself and some of the strategies that it's embraced have ended up being harmful. And this is an area also that we need to continue to explore, is how is feminism and the feminist movement implicated in perpetuating certain strategies of reproductive governance. Okay, I am going to talk just very briefly about the Geneva Consensus Declaration as a technology of reproductive governance. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the Geneva Consensus Declaration its full name is Geneva Consensus Declaration on Promoting Women's Health and Strengthening the Family. It is a non-binding declaration that was signed in October 2020, following a Trump administration campaign to form an international anti-abortion coalition. It was originally signed by 32 countries that are listed here. And the pillars of the Geneva Consensus Declaration are no international right to abortion, concern for women's health, protection of human life, strengthening the family as the basic unit of society, and defense of the sovereignty of nations in creating their own life protection policies absent external pressure. Now, if you read between the lines of this last point, what it really means is that nations should have the ability to create their own policies without the imposition of the international human rights courts. So the international human rights courts have been moving more and more in the direction of granting and expanding sexual and reproductive rights. And yet the Geneva Consensus Declaration is trying to roll that back and to say that each country should have its own sovereign ability to create its own protections for life and family. The United States had trouble finding reputable partners to sign the Geneva Consensus Declaration. After 2 years of work, only 3 European nations joined and only 3 countries in the Americas, including the United States. Many of the signatory countries are authoritarian regimes, flawed democracies, and/or countries that are ruled by repressive leaders who make control over sexuality and reproduction central to their political agendas. The other signatories are poor countries that depend on the United States for assistance. The Geneva Consensus Declaration uses reproduction and sexuality as a cornerstone to form permanent alliances, this is their term, among right-wing governments and political movements. And the reason they want to do this is they want to try and insulate themselves from changes in administration from one regime to another, or one government to another, and to try and create a bloc or a coalition that will oppose reproductive health and reproductive rights in UN bodies, including the World Health Organization. They decry ideological colonization of the West. They say that nations have a sovereign right to determine their own policies pertaining to life and family. They say they want to focus not on abortion or same-sex marriage, which they say are topics that divide us, but rather topics that unite us. This is one of their strategies. They say they support empowerment for women and girls and promote the health of women and girls across the life course. They're building this anti-abortion coalition at the United Nations and the Organization of American States. And they're seeking to strike terms such as sexual and reproductive health from UN documents and to pressure the World Health Organization on reproductive health matters. You will notice that the World Health Organization granted permanent observer status to the Holy See in June of this year. And this is building a coalition of nations that will commit to this work in multilateral forums, no matter which administration is in office in the United States or elsewhere. So some of the organizations that have been following what's going on here have called this an unholy alliance. This was the title of a report that came out in March of this year by Open Democracy, which you can find online. It's subtitled The Global Crusade Against Reproductive Justice. And it says this new alignment in foreign policy exposes the increased international influence of political religious factions, revealing unexpected alliances between Catholic, evangelical, and Islamic moralisms in the area of reproductive justice. These have one main goal: to diminish women's autonomy and agency to decide what they want for their own bodies. There have been reports by Open Democracy and by Common Dreams talking about how Europe was the main destination for dark money coming from US Christian right that's exporting its legal strategy, its lawyers, and its resources overseas to forestall and reverse international progress on abortion access. This is also happening in Latin America, I would point out, but Open Democracy says that most of the money has been going to Europe. And you may not be surprised given what you've seen in Europe over the last few years. This authoritarian package increasingly includes not just opposition to reproductive and sexual rights, but the targeting of migrants, opposing vaccination, opposing gender ideology, and in the United States, critical race theory, opposing LGBTQ rights, and looking at the privatization of gendered work. So no family leave policies, private education rather than public education, and so forth. This coalition promotes religious liberty. That's often the keyword that's used here. It promotes disinformation, toxic masculinity, narco states, and religious nationalism. So the afterlife of the Geneva Consensus Declaration, it was signed by a few more countries since right in the month right when Biden was inaugurated earlier this year. Then, but the Biden administration pulled the United States out of the Geneva Consensus Declaration. But other organizations have popped up to continue it and try and keep it alive. So Russia just signed it in November of this year, just last month, as did Guatemala. And US-based anti-abortion activists are still recruiting more countries to sign, and they did a big publicity blitz around the one-year anniversary of the Geneva Consensus Declaration in October. What they said was, if national legislators ask their governments to embrace it, then it will be effective despite the US leaving. So it hasn't died. It's still going on. You can keep an eye on it in coming soon to a country near you. One of the organizations, that has popped up to promote it is called the Institute for Women's Health, which put together a very glossy couple-minute film. The Institute for Women's Health is directed by a woman named Valerie Huber, who was an abstinence-only advocate and one of the architects of the Geneva Consensus Declaration during the Trump administration. She uses what scholars have called purple washing, which is co-opting the language of feminism to damage women's rights. So one of the quotes from them is, "Women make up the fabric of humanity, but too often their health is defined by agendas that prevent, compromise, or derail real progress. No longer." So the Institute for Women's Health is promoting itself as the true advocate and spokesperson for women's health. Conspicuously, the organization does not use the language of rights. It does not mention women's rights. It says that it aims to accelerate women's health gains at the World Health Assembly, United Nations, and the Organization of American States, which are all organizations where this conservative alliance has been infiltrating and solidifying its presence. So one step forward, the Geneva Consensus Declaration was designed to be a tool of reproductive governance. It draws on discourses of feminism and global health to undermine reproductive and sexual rights in multilateral forums and international human rights courts. But I would argue that the coalition itself is tenuous. It's still fractured. It hasn't gotten the kind of buy-in that it hoped for. And while that's been going on, reproductive rights activists continue to make considerable advances in reproductive rights and sexual rights. So I don't want to give the impression that the conservatives are winning. They may be winning the battles in some cases, but this is we're in it for the long term and we're in it together. So I want to thank you for your attention and for your solidarity, and also to appreciate your efforts in bringing us together to do this work so that we can learn from one another. So thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen at this point and open the forum for questions.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I think you captured very well what we are all kind of feeling since yesterday, is that we are learning a lot from each other, and it's very nice to find inspiration in each other's work. The floor is open for questions. I'm gonna see if I see any hands raised for the moment. I think Agatha was first. Go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for your talk. It was truly very informative and kind of gave us an overview of this use of reproductive governance, but in this global, approach. First I wanted to say that your article on Miss Mexico's dress was like an amazing find for me, and it really helped me connect the dots on Ordo Juris and this organization that's a branch of TFP in Poland, and what you said about money being funneled to Europe. Poland is, I think, becoming the European financial center of this movement, and they have considerable success in Poland. I would even go as far as to say that they have taken initiative in their hands, and they are now directing dictating the next steps, and not the government. I'm very interested in this connection between caring and punitive strategies. I came across this term carceral care, and we're kind of developing it in our project about criminalization. Whether we're looking at what we call prenatal hospices in Poland or other terms, but can you speak more to this connection of care and coercion, or appropriating the language of care to kind of I don't know, mask or dress up these reproductive governance practices?
Yeah, I think it's something that's actually been going on for quite a long time, but it's something that I'm just starting to think about in the context of reproductive governance. And I started thinking about it when I saw the language that was being used by this International Institute for Women's Health, this new organization that's popped up, and the fact that it was promoting itself as caring so much about women at the same time that it was standing for a complete ban on abortion. And it's using the language of empowerment And this is it's a concept that's come up in the United States with the arguments that were just heard at the Supreme Court also, where women are actually being oppressed by a regime that includes access to abortion and contraception, and that they would be liberated and empowered if that option were removed for them and they were able to realize their true destiny, which is to become mothers. And so they say, I know you're looking puzzled. It's a hard argument to understand, I agree, but it is an argument that I think some people through their religious convictions truly believe that that the gender rights movement, LGBT rights movements have actually oppressed and constricted and limited people's sexuality and reproductive capacity. And they're going to stand up for women by removing those barriers so that women can realize our true potential as mothers and as reproductive beings. And that goes for men too. So they're positioning themselves as the ones who truly care about women's health. Now, I say this goes back a long time because it was a conversation earlier, many decades ago, actually, in the Right to Life movement, where some of the Right to Life leaders, especially I think John Wilkie, who was a National Right to Life Committee, since passed away, said that the anti-abortion movement was targeting women and that it was making women look like they were the perpetrators of this crime of abortion rather than the victims of this crime. And so he wanted to think about what he called saving them both. Saving them both meant saving the unborn fetus and also saving the pregnant woman from needing to go through an abortion. So he said, we need to have compassion for pregnant women. We need to care for them. We need to support them. We need to provide assistance to them so that they can have their babies. And this meant economic assistance. It meant setting up maternity homes and homes for unwed mothers so that they could have the resources and support that they needed to bring the babies to term. So this was a kind of a combination of care and punitive attention, not giving them abortions, even when they were young girls, 10 years old, that they deserved to be cared for so that they could bear their children. So it's not a new strategy. It's not a new policy. It's something that continues. I think it's also something that Sue talked about in her work. And I don't know, Siri, if you would want to weigh in on this, but the strategy of post-abortion care is one that purports to care for women by reducing maternal mortality, and yet it doesn't care for women. It ends up harming women, really, in part because it doesn't prevent clandestine or unsafe abortion, and in part because it really reduces the space in which we can talk about the need to reform the laws or change the laws. So there are other strategies like this that have been organized around maternal mortality reduction that pretend to care for women, but that don't actually expand reproductive options for women.
Thank you. Does anybody want to weigh in on this point? Otherwise, I'll give the floor to Kim.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very interesting lecture, and so nice to see all this work sort of put together. That was really wonderful. I was just wondering, in light of the developments you discussed in the last part of your lecture, the Geneva Declaration, and all these reports on the dark money going into Europe. In the Netherlands, as I've already said a little bit yesterday, one of the things that we see is that there is this really big opposition between religious and secular. Well, there's actually, from the secular point of view, is the view on religious actors is that they're always conservative, right? And much of the work that myself and some other colleagues of mine that we do is we give guest lectures in public health courses in the universities to also try and show people like, well, maybe it's not such a good idea to see it in such black and white terms, because the, well, worldwide majority of women are religious, and religious movements like also the Pentecostal and charismatic movements are attractive to women. So we need to understand why that is. So it's very much focused on, okay, and try to understand, you know, that maybe forcing a choice between sexual and reproductive health and rights and being religious is maybe not a good idea. But what I see also is that now that this polarization is really intensifying, that more and more religious actors are actually sort of coming out in favor, very explicitly, in favor of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So opposing so within religious groups, you see much more also this sort of polarization, and not only sexual and well, I mean also sexual diversity, right? So so I was wondering if you have seen these developments also, for example, in South America, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important point, and it is something that I'm guilty of once in a while, is portraying all the religious hierarchies as conservative, and I know that's not true, and they're not monolithic. In Latin America, it's very common actually for feminist scholars to talk about the religious hierarchy rather than religion in general, because what they mean by that is that the religious hierarchy, the religious leaders, are often much more conservative than lay religious people are. And that's true in many different countries, especially because of the history of liberation theology and the pendulum swing that goes on even within the Catholic Church between the conservative end of the Catholic Church and the much more liberal progressive end of the Catholic Church. Liberation theology is still, we don't hear very much about it anymore these days, but it's still very, very popular in some, especially rural regions of Latin America. We don't see as much because the Catholic hierarchy has imposed bishops and priests who are more conservative, and yet there is still a strong element of progressive Catholics, social justice Catholics working in Latin America. So it's really important to talk about the religious hierarchy and to understand that that can change, although it doesn't seem to be changing as much as some people might have liked under the current Pope. As far as religious leaders coming out in favor of sexual and reproductive rights, I do see some of that in Costa Rica or in Latin America more broadly, but very little actually. I can think of just very, very few religious leaders who have been willing to stand up in favor of reproductive and sexual rights in Latin America. I think that's something that we might see more of in the future, especially as some of the cracks in these political religious alliances become more apparent, because those alliances I don't think are going to hold. They're very tenuous, and there are a lot of people, even right now, you hear people saying, well, you know, a certain portion of this movement is much more interested in political control than they are in the rights of the unborn, for example, and we don't want to support that. And so you see these cracks starting to emerge in some of these religious political coalitions. So that's something that we need to keep an eye on as well. But I'm glad you're doing those talks. It sounds like something very useful, and I wish we'd see more of that in different parts of the world.
Thank you. That was very nice. Yeah. We are actually developing an internet free online course on the topic as well. So.
Oh, wonderful. Please let us know.
I'll spread the news via this network. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Kim. Siri?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lynn, for a wonderful talk and a wonderful overview of, you know, what your article has inspired over the last 10 years. I wanted to respond. I have a question for you, Lynn, but I wanted to, you know, kind of speak to an earlier question about imbrications of care and violence, which, you know, certainly I've made the argument that that's the case when it comes to post-abortion care, but I would argue, and this is something that I talk about in my medical sociology classes, that we can think about rising rates of maternal mortality in the United States as a really great example of this, right? I mean, we have a lot of discourses around protecting motherhood, protecting, you know, saving mothers and babies in the United States. Yet, you know, we're one of, you know, two, along with Canada. This surprised me when I learned that Canada was in this, you know, bucket as well. We're one of only two countries, developed countries, where maternal mortality has been on the rise in the last 2 decades. So I think it's important to think about these contradictions between discourses of care and protection, while American, you know, rates of chronic disease are, you know, on the rise among American women, right? Women are entering into pregnancy in states of poor health, and also confronting hyper-medicalized forms of delivery care, right? Including cesarean section and a lack of access to healthcare more generally. So my question for you, Lynn, is, well, first of all, I also wanted to add to how you described reproductive governance as an analytical tool, as opposed to a rallying political cry. And I wanted to, you know, let you know how useful I have found reproductive governance as a teaching tool in sociology, and in, you know, kind of how it allows students to understand that reproduction is not just a women's issue, right? And that it is deeply connected to political and economic goals. And I find that it's been really useful in you know, kind of pushing back against this idea that reproduction is just a women's issue, and also in, you know, engaging young men in my classes when it comes to reproduction, because often my classes on reproduction are mostly populated by young women. And so I think that, you know, it offers space for people who might otherwise think that, you know, reproduction is not an issue that really concerns them. So the other question that I wanted to ask is, you know, a professional one and an epistemological one, you know, thinking about what has happened in the last 10 years since you published this article, how the concept of reproductive governance has been taken up. What do we need to be doing in the next 10 years or 20 years when it comes to thinking and teaching and publishing about reproductive governance, about reproductive justice and rights? As you know, I'm a sociologist, and I had to flee to the field of anthropology in order to find people who spoke my language, right? Because sociology continues to be a very US, at least American sociology, continues in the field of reproduction, continues to be a very US focused a discipline. And you know, all of us know how difficult it is to find funding to do this kind of work, and even to find publishers, whether that these are book presses or journals that are open and friendly to the work that we're doing, because it often is so interdisciplinary. And there's a lot of disciplinary boundary work and gatekeeping that happens in publishing venues. So what would you like to see happening in terms of teaching, publishing, and research when it comes to this very productive tool that you have given to us?
Well, that's a big question, and I'm not sure I have the answers. I'd like to hear what other people have to say about that too, Siri. I do think that a conference like this is a good place to start. And I think that, thinking about sociology and what sociology has to offer, I think that anthropology too, even though you found a refuge in anthropology, I think that anthropology too has its limitations. And as I said earlier, I think one of those limitations has been that we consider the field too narrowly. And by the field, we think about the region where we work or the country where we work, and we're not thinking about these terms more broadly. So I've found the interdisciplinary conversations very useful. The sociologists are used to thinking more comparatively and at a larger scale than the anthropologists have been in general, perhaps. The historians have also been very useful in this. The political scientists, as much as sometimes I chafe at the emphasis on electoral politics and so forth, that and typologies and frameworks and so forth that the political scientists come up with, their work I've also found very useful, as well as work in feminist public health. And so working at the edges of our disciplines in whatever way we can, I think can be very productive, engaging in those conversations with our colleagues who are in philosophy or in public health or legal scholars as well. And then making sure that the kinds of considerations that we're concerned with are also making their way into policy. So I've been more and more feeling like I need to be in conversation with some of the policy people, some of the strategists who are doing both the investigative reporting, but also the policy work, and trying to create room for our perspectives there as well. That's a big job. It's more work than one person can do. But I think if each of us can do it in the way that we are able to, that will be helpful. Another thing that you mentioned made me feel like the teaching work shouldn't be overlooked. The teaching work is really important. And I think the teaching work is, as you say, a way of making a new generation of young people, of citizens and scholars, also aware of the connections among these different issues, so that we teach about reproductive governance and reproductive politics and the kind of work that we're doing, not just in classes on reproduction, but in all the classes that we teach. So after a while, I started including all of this in my intro classes as well, because I felt like it was something that I wouldn't necessarily have made room for, but I know a number of the students that come through the intro classes are never going to take a course on reproduction. And so make sure that we can work it in there too. As far as the publishing and so forth, I'm not sure that I have the answers to that. I mean, there's so much that's going on in the publishing world right now that is outside of our control, really. But keeping these alliances together and working with one another and trying to find homes for our scholarly work, I think is something that we have been able to do. I mean, I'd like to hear from other people about how that's been going, but I feel like in general we've been able so far to find each other, and that's good. Okay, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I'll take the liberty to extend Siri's question to all other participants who maybe want to have to say something about that. And then Claudia, go ahead.
Are we waiting for other people to say something more there?
Oh no, it was your turn.
All right. Thank you very much, Lynn. It's wonderful to hear you after reading and seeing all the people that have been inspired, including ourselves. I wanted to tell you that recently I had a very interesting experience with Diana Mar and a young colleague here in Brazil, and I decided to organize a special issue of a Brazilian Anthropology magazine around the theme of reproductive governance. And so it brought us to compare a whole lot our expectations and our views between Diana, who's looking at things from Spain and Europe, and us who are looking at things from Latin America here at home. And first of all, I want to say in Latin America, we have tremendous scholarship in the field of gender studies, feminist studies, women's rights, reproductive rights, and LGBT, queer studies and all like that. But they never seem to converge, or very seldom, with a concern about children's socialization within the home, the whole family-oriented analysis. And that's what I found very exciting in reproductive governance. But it's interesting because where Diana was expecting a lot of papers on transnational abortion, travel, surrogacy, and new reproductive technologies, we didn't receive from our Latin American colleagues a whole slew of articles along those lines. And instead we got a lot on stratified reproduction and even things dealing with adoption to some extent, and of course medical science. And so I'd like to hear you, if you've noticed this kind of different emphasis according to, and I was going to say money has something to do with it, because in Europe lots of people have access to travel to new technologies, medically assisted, etc., that we just don't have in Latin America. And I'd like to hear if you see these regional differences and the relevance of them.
I think that's a really interesting question. I hope you'll write about it in the special issue of the journal that you're putting together. It puts me in the mind of thinking about the politics of theory. And I'm aware very much that the conversations that are going on in each country are particular to the kinds of issues that we're dealing with in the context in which we're working, both university contexts, disciplinary contexts, and also political contexts. And so it seems right to me that there would be different emphases in different places, and that I hope the concept of reproductive governance is broad enough to be able to accommodate a lot of the differences that we're seeing. But you know, I wrote an article a few years ago about abortion, about reproductive rights or reproductive justice using lessons from Argentina. And one of the things that I became aware of, as I describe in that article, is that the reproductive justice conversation was very much a conversation that came out of a US historical context for very particular kinds of historical reasons that had to do with what we were dealing with in the United States. Whereas in Argentina, the emphasis was very much on reproductive rights for exactly the same reason, because of the history of dictatorship and the post-dictatorship conversations around expanding and extending human rights to different groups of people in the Kirchner regime after the dictatorship. And so the conversations in each country were very different, and it wasn't like one framework could be imposed on another country without really considering the politics of theory in that country. And so we need to think about where our theoretical concepts come from and how it is that they're evolving in relationship to a regional or a national conversation that's going on in the countries where we're working. So it seems to me that the differences that you identified in your conversation with Diana are very useful because they direct us exactly to thinking about where are our theories coming from and what are they good for? Why this theory at this moment in time in this particular place, rather than some of the other theoretical tools that are available to us. So I think that's really useful, and it's really useful too in doing that comparison and exactly having that conversation, because you learned something about Spain and Diana learned something about Brazil or about Latin America and what's going on there in the course of doing that. So that's where it happens. You know, that's what our scholarship is all about. And that's one of the reasons I'm so grateful for this kind of exchange.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at this point? Questions, remarks, or perhaps answers to previously asked questions? I like the fact that we have been discussing the difficulties or how we can continue using this scholarship, and also how what obstacles we're having. Because one of the great things about this concept of governance is indeed that you can connect to different disciplinary fields at the same time: economics, medical sciences, and even developments, industry or development studies. And it can be useful to criticize also practices that are going on there. That's how I personally actually encountered the concept and found it useful for my own study. So perhaps other people want to share how they have been, how they got into the literature on reproductive governance and how it relates to their work. If you like to do that, then please go ahead. Otherwise, if there are no more comments, Esther, yes?
Hi, I was just thinking about what you were saying earlier about the Geneva Consensus and it being a form of or a tool of global reproductive governance. And I was just thinking, you know, in the context of how language is co-opted by conservative either politicians or political parties or factions, we're kind of living in this time where like there's sort of a feeling of language can be used in ways that are against you. And I guess one of the things that I'm realizing as you were talking about it is that reproductive governance as an analytical tool actually allows a certain amount of nuance that will continue to, you know, even as you talk about things like the Geneva Consensus Declaration using the global reproductive governance analytical tool, it allows you to distinguish the clear difference between that and between the ICPD without losing any sharpness, which, you know, otherwise I found in the work that I did before being an academic, you know, sexual and reproductive rights and health often can get used in policy spaces against people who are actually advocating for an increase of reproductive rights. So that's useful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That helps to sharpen something that I've been thinking about for a while, and something that a lot of activists have said is that the activists on the so-called pro-life, pro-family side have been using the same strategies as the activists on the pro-reproductive rights and LGBT rights side, that they've been adopting the same kinds of strategies. And again, Juan Marcovaggioni's work has been really useful to me in thinking about this, because he's identified how the pro-life and pro-family activists have been very strategically, deliberately adopting the language of science, the language of human rights, the language of bioethics, and so forth, to promote their ideas using the same concepts and the same kind of language. So it's very useful to do that. And they would, of course, say the same about us. You know, they would say that that's exactly what we're doing. And so that's one of the things I think that reproductive governance, the concept, allows us to get that kind of distance so that we can see not only that our political opponents or adversaries may be using that kind of concept, but that we're doing it too, if you know what I mean. So yes, so who gets to own language? You know, it's back to that old question about what is it? What do words mean? You know, words mean what I say they mean, and not what anyone else says they mean. So but thank you. That's very useful for me. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? I thought I saw Bruna at some point raising her hand. I don't know if you're still wanting to ask a question.
Hi, thank you, Lynn, for this talk. It has been really interesting. Yeah, I raised my hand, but it's because I was just thinking about the relationship between reproductive governance and specifically motherhood, because we are talking about women's rights, reproductive rights, but motherhood has disappeared from the literature. And I was just thinking about this relationship, but just to put this on the table, because I don't know exactly a specific question, what a specific question I can ask, but I was thinking about this relationship. If you have some ideas or something to.
Yeah, I think that's not unrelated to the point that Claudia was making about family policy and what's going on with child rearing. It's certainly something that that I'm aware of, that the reproductive governance does concern not just reproductive rights or sexual rights, but has to do with a whole series of labor policies, of family leave policies, which is a big debate that we've been having again in the United States, about childcare during the pandemic, about access to healthcare, about incarceration, about housing. You know, all these things are related really to reproductive governance. And that's one of the things that Laura Briggs has helped us to see in her work in thinking about how all politics are reproductive politics. So you're absolutely right. I shouldn't be giving short shrift to motherhood or to any of the other dimensions of social reproduction that are important to our lives. It's just the area where I happen to be working right now. So thank you for bringing us back around to that.
Okay, I don't see any further questions, so I'll just like to thank you very much again, Lynn, for this keynote, and all of the participants for engaging in this conversation. It has been incredibly interesting and inspiring for me. I hope the same for you. And let's stay in touch, I'd say.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you.